Thank you for being here. Oh, you're going to hang for a little bit?
Yeah, I got a little bit of time.
I appreciate you. You're going to kill the music, right? Thank you, Corey. Maybe not kill it, just turn it down a little. Ready to rock and roll. Let me, before you go, let me just sit this up. Just in case I need a sip while I'm reading. I usually don't do it.
Is there an audience out there?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Lane. I am the Executive Director of the Furious Flower Poetry Center here at James Madison University. Can I have the Furious Flower, the nation's first academic center dedicated to the study of Black poetry. We are here tonight in partnership with AAAD, which is the African American and Diaspora Studies Center here at JMU that's having their 15th annual conference. The theme is Land and Freedom, and we're so excited to be part of that conference and bringing our distinguished poet, David Mills, to share his work with us tonight, which you will realize is a wonderful connection with that theme of land and freedom. I'm going to tell you a little bit about David Mills. He holds an MFA from Warren Winson College and an MA from New York University, both in creative writing. He's published 4 poetry collections: The Sudden Country, The Dream Detective, Actor Mystic, and Boneyard, which is primarily what you'll be reading from tonight, and which is the only book of poems about slavery in Manhattan, New York. It's the winner of the North American Book Award, was a finalist for the Crab Orchard Review Prize, the Houstonic Book Award, and the Richard Snyder Memorial Prize. Mills's poems have appeared in several impressive publications, and he's received fellowships, grants, and residencies from several institutions, including the New York Foundation for the Arts, Breadloaf, the American Antiquarian Society, the Lannan Foundation, the Schomburg Center, Cave Canem, among others. He was a recipient of the Langston Hughes Society Award, and cool fun fact, he lived in Langston Hughes' landmark Harlem home for 3 years. Not so cool. He's also cool because he recorded his poetry on ESPN. I'll ask you about that in the Q&A. And RCA Records, and has had his work displayed at the Venice Biennial. So he's also, talk about cool, the subject of a documentary called Freak the Language. Mills is currently the Bronx County Historical Society poet in residence. I'm going to tell you 3 more things, maybe 2. One, I mentioned Cave Canem, that it's a workshop for Black poets that I've been a part of, and actually Vic and I were talking, and we were there together. We just realized in 2007, which was a really long time ago. So we've known each other since 2007 when we were in workshop together. He also is no stranger to Harrisonburg and to Furious Flower, and he was here for a reading, and he read from that Langston Hughes work. In 2011, I was going through our archive and found some photos of him, some action shots. We're going to get some more tonight to add 14 years later. He also came back in 2017 and was one of our fellows for our Yusuf Kuminyaka seminar, which our Summer Legacy seminars celebrate distinguished writers, and so he joined us as one of the fellows who was studying Yusuf Kuminyaka. So he has a history with Fierce Flower. He was walking around Harrisburg and saying, oh, I know this place. And that's pretty awesome. And it was just really wonderful to spend a day with him as he took his photos for our journal that he will be featured in, as he talked to me about being here. We've had some wonderful conversations, and I'm really looking forward to you hearing his really incredible poetry. So, before I forget, I need to thank our online audience. Tonight is being live streamed. So, online audience, we are so glad you're here with us. Please feel free to use the chat in the places where we're going to be yelling and hollering. You can say boot, boot, boot in the chat box. And also in the Q&A, we invite you to use that for questions. Thank you, live audience, for being here by yourself. And let's give David a JMU Furious Flower Harrisburg.
You can hear me? Okay. Good evening, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Furious Flower. And, excuse me. And thank you to the African and African American Diasporic Conference and Dr. Gavin and Dolores. So the book is called Bone Yarn. It's the first book of poems about slavery in Manhattan. I'm working on one about slavery in the Bronx, where I grew up. So I used to say slavery in New York. Now I say slavery in Manhattan. This first piece is called Chimney Sweep Apprentice, and I'm sure most of you have seen Mary Poppins. And Dick Van Dyke, Chim Chimchery, he was a chimney sweep. And the actual boys, and it was always boys who did the work, were called the chimney sweep apprentices. And they would be between 5 and 18 years old. I've only lived in a house once, so didn't know that the chimneys or the flues, they don't just go straight up and down, they curve. And so these boys' backs would be deformed. These were enslaved boys, and there were white boys, and I don't say that in the pejorative way, who did this sort of work in England. But in New York, enslaved boys would do this. They would have a master sweep who was like the Dick Van Dyke character, who would go around with them, and he was also enslaved. And the way the work went, they would do it in the winter holidays. They would go out at 3 in the morning and they would exclaim, "Soot, weep, weep." And the white colonial settlers would know that these boys were available to do the work, so they could be going from weather like this to over 100 degrees within minutes. The first industrial cancer, and maybe the first cancer that we know of in North America, these boys got because the soot and the sweat would go down into their private areas, and they got a cancer, a scrotal cancer. A cap damper is a covering, and excuse me, I tend to explain these poems because this is kind of squeezed history, not dealt with. A cap damper is a covering on a chimney to keep out wind and precipitation. A hearth is like a fireplace. Let me just see if there's... Oh, have any of you heard, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, light a fire under him? Do you know where that comes from? So these chimney sweeps, apprentices, would only wear the equivalent of like a pamper and a sweep cap to keep as much of the soot off of them as possible. And this happened to the white kids in England and the enslaved in New York. Many of the kids were terrified to do this. I have claustrophobia. And so they would just go up into the very beginning of the flue and hope that the master sweep wouldn't see them. And then another boy would look and he would tell the master sweep, oh, they are not going in to do the work. And so the master sweep would come with a torch and light it under their bare feet. So that's where that phrase comes from. Don't use it lightly going forward. New York at the time, if any of you are familiar with the city or Manhattan, was a mile wide and a mile and a half long. It only went from the Battery to Chambers Street, so it was much smaller than it is now. So here we go, Chimney Sweep Apprentice, and if there's anything else, I'll explain afterwards. I'm what happens when a house breathes out. Sore black breath in a New York throat, trapped caterpillar. What they think of me, owners of these homes and white massa who hires me out to black massa sweep. Elbows, ankles, knees up zigzag chimneys, squeeze of heat and dusk, soot head to toe, dirt thick as a shirt, palms facing out, stomach up against an empty. My days a brick wide and a brick and a half long. I could die here. But brush above my head I chuck soot, chip tar with a scraper, black rain peppering my neck and the hot coast of my eyes. Filth to the sides of flues, mazes sticky with poison, hearth to cap damper. I started prenticing when I was 6. I'm now 18. Flesh leathery, ankles swelled to black apples. Growing is a stunt. I can't say which is better, cramped heat or winter's chill. My cry, sit or weep, weep, on the street or pinched in the flu. My life up in nothing but smoke. Thank you. So this next piece is called Bless This House. There are a lot of what we call in our craft persona poems. So they're in the voices of other people. And there were rigid divisions of labor, both with enslaved women, free women of color, and white women almost exclusively working in the domestic sphere. And one of the things that was curious or distinct from the enslaved ancestors in the South, other than those who were the house Negroes, is almost 95% of the enslaved in New York lived with their enslavers, either in the cellars or the attics. And most of the women lived in the cellars because that's where the kitchen was. They would cook down there, and they slept on these hard stone floors. And it was this intimacy and distance because although they lived in the house with their enslavers, they would often only go up to like the door at the top of the stairs, let's say the enslaved cook, knock on the door from the outside if like they're delivering food. They would wait for the mistress to make some sort of signal noise. They would head back down the stairs. The mistress would open the door and take the food into the main part of the house. So this is in the voice of a woman, enslaved woman named Peggy, who's the cook in this house. It's called Bless This House, Peggy.
Backstairs twisting like my braids. Every time I gently place tray after hot tray on that dusty top step. My bulky reflection tangled in the platter's words. Bless this house. Must be only the missus part it's talking, 'cause there's little blessed living in this here cellar. But she and me got the hours straight. 8s, 12s, 6s, Sunday 6s is 5s. When the tips of my fingers tap my side of the door. Wait. Tap again. Till I hear her clear her throat. Then I know, the mistress knows, they eats is ready. In their world, where people only belch and dream, rest of her family thinks supper just shows up.
So there were two major, well, one was actually not, but there were two alleged major sort of revolts in New York. One in 1712, which was actual, where there were approximately 30 enslaved Africans, enslaved Native Americans, and what they call Spanish Negroes, which is an ambiguous designation. There were likely Semitic Arab men who were caught out in the Atlantic by the English, that not that anyone should have been enslaved, but they were sort of insisting they were Bantu Africans and brought them to the Americas, and these guys would protest to the nth that no, we're not, but they were still enslaved. And so this is called The Body as a Metropolis. Let me just share a few things. So this actually wasn't connected with the 1741 slave conspiracy, which my understanding and belief on my research is that it didn't actually happen. There were 12 fires over a 3-week period that they blamed on a group of enslaved Negroes called the Geneva Club. Geneva was a gin back at that time. And the likelihood is there was only one fire set by a Negro enslaved person, but approximately 30 individuals were either hung, burned at the stake, or, as they call it, broken on the wheel. And I like to say, and I was saying to Bob, and he came here, and I'd like to thank him. He was the gentleman who did the photography earlier. Tell the whole story. And I think most of us have heard about individuals being burned at the stake in what I call Western Asia, what most of you would call Europe. There's no bifurcation of the landmass from what we know of as Asia, but the victors often tell the story and make the rules. Well, let me throw it out as a question. How many white colonial settler women were burned at the stake during the Massachusetts or the Salem witch hunts trials? Anyone know? There were none. But I think a lot of people assume that there were women, white colonial settler women, who were burned at the stake. And actually, even in England, there were none. There was only one that was burned at the stake, which was in Scotland. But this is where these erasures get dangerous. There were well over 40 enslaved African individuals burned at the stake in New York between the 1712 actual slave riot and the conspiracy where likely only one of the fires was started by an enslaved person. The head of the Geneva Club was a Negro named Caesar who was enslaved, and there were often deals made between the owners and the enslaved where they allowed the enslaved to drink during the day, various other things. So Caesar was also a petty thief, and he had a relationship, some lower class whites had relationships with the enslaved that were more porous, and there was a gentleman named John Hewson. Are you here, Paul, still? Okay, so I said it to you earlier, who owned a tippling house, which was basically a bar, and he would take these stolen goods from Caesar and fence them, sell them, and give Caesar money. Caesar actually had a child with an Irish woman named Peggy. As I said, there were 12 fires, and there were the 30 enslaved Africans, Native Americans, Spanish Negroes, but they also hung Hewson and his wife and 2 other whites, being Peggy, Caesar's, the woman who had his child, and I'm forgetting the other person who was male. And they hung all of them, but then they hung Hewson and Caesar again next to each other as a kind of symbolic thing to say, hey, if you mess around, this will happen to you. And they left their bodies up there for 3 months, and it was really putrid and all that other good stuff, if you know what I mean. Let me just, there's some kind of specific. So Jews Alley, the first Jewish community that came to the United States, not just New York, they were Sephardic Jews, not Ashkenazi, who came from Brazil. And they had a synagogue, and the street that they would walk down to get to the synagogue was called Jews Alley. Well, I won't get into that because many of you might not know these kind of geographic things. And I say that respectfully. Let me find this other page. So, and then there were slave codes, which I'm sure those of you who studied slavery in the South. So things like if 3 Negroes congregated, you could be whipped. You could be whipped for laughing. You could be whipped if you're out, after dark. So they believed that they were resisting because of that. We were allowed to go to churches that whites went to, but if you were kind of joking around after church, you could be beat. Ham here, I'm referring to the curse of Ham, not the food, although I'm playing with food here. There are 12 fires, and what I do is I won't say extended metaphors, but I use body parts of Caesar and Hewson to sort of catalog the fires, and I'll do this so you'll understand when I'm doing a different fire. If anything else, I'll explain it afterwards. So this is called The Body as a Metropolis. Through a chilly side door opening onto Jews Alley, Caesar slipped into Hog's shop, palm, silver, linen, and pieces of 8, squirreled housewares under his master's floorboard. But robbery turned to conspiracy when Irish Mary claimed that February at Hewson's tippling house, hunched over leg of mutton and drams of rum, Caesar, 6 other Ethiops, and Hewson hatched a plan to start at the fly market and paint the city in flames. For the slave codes, the stop frolic, the no stroll after church out. And just like the goose Hewson had Mary serve those sable grains of ham, she swore those men would be cooked on both sides. Echoing in April nearly 3 decades earlier, May, shadowy glen betwixt Windmill and Potbaker's Hill, that last thieving winter still with Caesar, the Nigra emperor, when from the gallows for the burglary he cenched. Floor refused his twitching feet, his body a weapon turned against him. its weight as if he were standing on his jaw, never confessed because pride is the father of a pig-headed death. 2. But Caesar's ending ended again, drooped for light and heat they couldn't pin on him, cut down, rehung, swinging in chains from a gibbet on an aisle in the Little Collect. A body left to rot is a message and a metropolis. So this is the body parts. Caesar's head was ablaze on March 18th, his thoughts Fort George. Caesar's pate was Wednesday, the harbor viewed from a hill, chapel bells, a lull of wood, gunpowder that could have blown, but the fort burned down because of a plumber's soldering iron. Caesar's tongue was a soon quench, a captain's house near the Long Bridge, a March 25th, the faulty chimney's fault. Caesar's shoulder was a warehouse by a dockside owned by Van Zandt. Caesar's shoulder had a haystack, was a deal board near the East River. Caesar's shoulders were 3 fires 3 Wednesdays in a row, was an April 1st to the ground burned and a little fishy, was what would another Wednesday have in store pinned on a corncob pipe. Caesar's kidney was a cow stable at the fly market, dusk on April 4th. Caesar's kidney was alarming, a lane of maidens where roofs were palms and smoke never got out of hand or haystack. Caesar's kidney was getting suspicious, was proof of the fact that fear shares 3 letters with fire. Caesar's spleen was nearby, and soon thereafter, a cry of fire before old smokes cleared. Caesar's spleen was a flicker, a loft where slaves slept. Caesar's spleen was soon extinguished, and Thomas's place was arson as African art. 3. John Hewson, bobbing Irish potato in an Anglican pot. Hewson, scrawny in a city bloated with property owners, fenced stolen goods for the Geneva Club Negroes, hid coins for Caesar that Caesar had pocketed. But when the court offered loose-lipped Mary freedom, she couldn't credit the enslaved with spearheading the plot. Hewson, her boss, had to emboss the ring. Her words wrung John's neck. Final ride from the city, warty tree toads chortling, Hewson standing tall. 4. Chained to a gibbet beside Caesar, Hewson also gives up his own ghost twice. Another carcass left to rot is a memorandum to a metropolis. Hewson's mouth was Sunday morning, Murray's coach house was nestled coals in a haystack. Hewson's mouth was April 5th on Lower Broadway, was a trail of embers snaking to the neighbors. Hewson's mouth was a mild suspicion of a Negro in there. Hewson's lips were proud parents letting their fire go out for the first time on its own. Hewson's lung was 4 more fires all on Monday. No, that's not true. Hewson's lung was 10 a.m., was Burns's chimney. Hewson's neck was 2 hours later, was Hilton's roof just east of Sawley's, was up in flames, was evidence. Hewson's tear ducts were vigilantes, Monday's interruption. Hewson's tear ducts were magistrates and Spanish Negroes and 4 o'clock. Hewson's tear ducts were take a seat but give it back. Because Hewson's liver was an alarm in a warehouse on New Street. Because Hewson's liver was fire on a shingle's heels where smoke tottered. Because Hewson's liver was a Negro in a blue coat with a red lining in flight. Hewson's stomach was the final cry and temper tantrum. Hewson's stomach was Negroes rising like a mutiny of smoke. Hewson's stomach was what wasn't yet, a nation, what it would have prayed for. But right now, it only had a God and a bottomless hunger for a country. A gibbet is a gallows with one arm. Thank you. A gibbet is a gallows with one arm, and fly market is a mispronunciation of vlei market, which is a Dutch. Vlei means valley in Dutch, or a low-lying area. Okay. We're doing okay out there? Okay. So there are a number of dialogue poems in the book. I forgot to say this. There are 15,000 bodies in this grave, or the cemetery, and it's 7 acres. As I said, New York was a mile wide and a mile and a half long, so it only, if you're familiar with Manhattan, it only went up as far north as Chambers Street. So the African burial ground, the Negro burial ground, was outside of Chambers Street. So the southern border was Chambers Street, the northern was Duane Street, the eastern was Center Street, although it wasn't called Center at the time, and the western was Broadway. And I was struggling, and not struggling like sort of difficult, but struggling on an emotional level. Like, how do you, excuse me. How do you write across 300 years of silence? So I started asking questions of or to the bones, and was imagining their I don't normally do this. Was imagining their responses. And it was interesting, and Dr. Gavin and Lauren, you know him. I had gotten a grant initially to work on this and had a year, and you have to do a final presentation. I probably wrote over 200 pages of drafts, but like revised 20 pages for the presentation, and thought, okay, I'm done with this. And I started having these dreams, and I was hearing these kind of disembodied voices, and I have many issues, but suffering from auditory hallucinations is not one of them. And I was like, this kind of feels like it has something to do with that project. And I actually called Tim Siebels, and this book probably exists because of him, because he said, be still and listen. The ancestors want you to tell their story. So there are actually lines in here that came to me in the dream state as I started sleeping with a pad or, spiral notebook next to me. Okay, so there was a doctor's riot in 1789. Columbia University, does anyone know where it was originally in New York City? So I'm sure some of you have heard of Trinity Church. So it was actually a one-room schoolhouse that was attached to Trinity Church. And there was a poor white cemetery and then the Negro burial ground. And the medical school students, which I couldn't believe could be as young as 15 years old. I don't know that I would want to go to any doctor who was like 19. So initially, bodies were sent from the south in hogshead cask and barrels, and they started running out. So the students started raiding first the poor white cemetery, which was called the Pauper Cemetery, and then they started raiding the Negro burial ground. And one time, one of the students hung an arm out the window of his anatomy class, and a young white male was walking by, working class, and he said, "Oh, this is your mother's arm." And it turned out that they had just buried the guy's mother. So he freaked out. It might not very well have been his mother's arm. He got his father. A bunch of poor working class whites went to the school, and they were going to massacre these, 15-year-old medical school students. And the Negroes who were free tried to petition what you would know of as the city council. They called it common council, to stop the grave robbing. And this is in the voice, or the dialogue is imagining one of those souls or bones speaking of the travesty of what was happening in them. So it's called Talking to the Bones, Columbia University victim. What of the way of your demise? This box is death's wooden bondage. Were you buried in a coffin? No matter. This colony's a coffin with shores instead of sides. What of these students of physics? I've heard when a body's scooped, chocolate coffins are anatomy class coffers. But their behavior, they stole what had already been stolen. For us, white was never wanted, but constantly wanting. But why put the crown of your head in the crook of your arm? They sawed bone to what they thought was thoughts. They discovered and exhumed you for what? Life had already taken my life. Medicine just cracked open its questions. But why only on earth at night? 'Cause darkness don't inspect the devil's sweat. And there were many of the bone skeletons were deformed, and it's not clear if that was a result of development, 50, 100 years later, or if things happened to people in their death, because they were violent deaths. And so this, I'm imagining it's a male. Well, there is an actual male. His skull was next to his ribs when they opened the casket. Okay, so we'll move to, there was a slave market, which is where Wall meets Water Street, if you're familiar with that part of the city. It's on the east side. And the dock workers and the rapper KRS-One, he says about children of color, don't allow your children to watch television because they will think their lives or their history started in shackles and it ends at the barrel of a gun. And Christopher Columbus, before he came to the New World, went to Ghana first. Most people don't know this. And the likelihood is he learned to tack, which is sailing against the wind, from the Mandinka. They were incredible sailors from the Mali Empire. So there were enslaved Africans who were brought to the New World who were great maritime folks. And some of them were so good that their enslavers, and this actually happened in New York, not only let them work the docks, but let them sail, as I call it, back to Western Asia. And in my mind, some of them came back, or most of them came back. I'm like, dude, even if I didn't know where that was, I would have been out of there. Like, I'm not coming back. So, as I said, there were kind of these rigid divisions of labor amongst cisgender individuals. So they had these men working the docks, enslaved Negroes and white men working the docks, and they would know when they couldn't see the ship that there was a slave ship coming into port. Does anyone have a sense of why that might have happened? It could be as far as 3 miles off the coast of New York. Right, because they're in the holds of the ships 3 months, and with the men, they rarely let them come above deck. The women, more frequently, they'd be washed off, but you got feces, you're packed up against each other, obviously the sweat, and it's all there. So that's one thing. And, slave ships were sometimes called Guineamen because there's a country in West Africa named Guinea, and obviously people were abducted from there as well. There were Native Americans, as I said, who were enslaved, and when the use sometimes of an enslaved person for the enslaver who purchased them ran out, they would send them to where the slave market was to rent themselves out. So I refer to that in this piece. And naked sale is an economic or Wall Street term where basically you sell a stock that you don't own at a lower price, or no, you obtain a stock that you don't own at a lower price, or you say you own it, you pretend to sell it to someone as if you own it, and then you actually purchase it and you sell it to them for the higher price, and you make the difference or split the difference. But it's a bit of punning on the nakedness of the ancestors. So this is called auction, hell's unbidden hello. The stench smashed against every dockside nostril, sweat's unanswered dread, cruelty's cheap perfume. That reek proclaimed the unseen but surely limping Guineaman, a seasick fist, bald, faltering in the Atlantic, harboring 3 months of the West African terror. The squinting whys in those abducted eyes, what the ocean failed to answer. Hell's first hello. A street nudged by the East River, rowboats, oars, Pier 17, the old slip where Wall met Water Street. Pacing cobbles, a white gentleman, nothing but tummy and mutton chops, would mount the platform, hoist the gavel, and 50 Africans would lumber from the hold up 6 dank steps, huddling under a wooden roof where, at the foot of the city, lazing beneath the forked shadow of a dragon beam, Indians and the colony's long since slaves were sent to seek new ways to scoop a shilling and sweat. were rented, hired, or let out by the day or week. Uneyed, mobile, downtime, cozy, but the huddled. For sale, young strapping buck along with a Negro wench. Inquire at 57 Janeway Lane. Bought, traded, auctioned off to till and build, to chore and cook. In and around this un-Southern structure, this New England gazebo, looming, buyers circled, eyed ballooning chest, smalls of back, scoops and flanks, preparing for a nearly naked sail, a white middle and index finger, nose along a brow's frightened horizon. Beads of sweat, signal and gift brought to that buyer's tongue. Smack, a colony's first taste of a continent. Not salty, hence not sick, an African is sold along with a knob of unsifted cereal grass. Does anyone know why I did this? I love myself, right? So, the white colonial settlers erroneously believed that if they tasted salt in the sweat of an abducted African, that they were sick and they wouldn't buy them. And cereal grass, I forgot to say this, so the slave market and then the fly market, which was the valley, whatever, was almost the equivalent of a modern day farmer's market. So if you could imagine going to the farmer's market, getting your organic whatever, and literally in the next stall is a human body being sold. That's basically kind of what's happening. And I refer to the naked sale as well, again, telling the whole story. There were 24 white colonial settler males who met under what they called a buttonwood tree, what you would probably refer to if you're into, trees, a sycamore. And the first stocks that were traded in New York were traded under this tree in 1792. 3 of the first 5 stocks traded in New York City had to do with slavery. Ensuring the bodies of the enslaved, underwriting the production of cotton, and ensuring the transport of those ships. So there's like no bifurcation. And here's an even deeper thing, at least for me, maybe because I'm a New Yorker. Where that buttonwood tree was is exactly where the New York Stock Exchange sits today. A continuum of an economic history and the ugliness of it. So I'm going to shift gears a little. I have a manuscript of poems about a Tuskegee Airman named Harry Stewart Jr., and he just died 10 days ago, February 2nd. And obviously there was that kind of desire with one of those executive orders to not talk about the Tuskegee Airmen specifically, which blew my mind. And, I like to be fair. If somebody's stepping up, give them their just. And one of the people who said we got to not do this was Pete Hegseth. And I don't know that I want to be hanging out with him a lot, but you got to give people their due. So, it wasn't taken away. So Harry grew up in Queens, which is where I live, and that was sort of why I went to this project. And he had a childhood friend who was of Caribbean ancestry named Joseph Gordon, who moved when they were about 6 years old, and Harry didn't see him ever again until they ended up at Tuskegee training to be airmen. And Tuskegee Airmen were the first Negro pilots. They were in World War II. They trained, Joe was 2 or 3 classes ahead of him. He ended up in what was called Operation Anvil, which is this thing in southern France, and he got shot down and killed. Harry, years later, moves back to Queens. He's living in the Dory Miller housing complex, which Dory Miller was actually a hero in World War II as well in the Navy. And he didn't know it when he moved in, but Joseph's mother was living right down the hall from him. And so he's kind of beginning to befriend her, and obviously with Joseph having died, it's kind of tense. So this is sort of imagining this exchange between the two of them. And as I said, he was of Caribbean ancestry. So at one point, the mother says, "Lord have mercy," which is an exclamation of shock that I'm sure Lauren could confirm or maybe not confirm. Satin Nat refers to Nat King Cole. Wampum were things that Native Americans used. And I used the word Indian in that poem because that was the diction of the time. I don't use that, as an individual myself. Lucky Strikes or cigarettes. Okay, I'll read, and then if there's anything I need to explain. So it's called Almost Always. 1956, Harry Stewart living in Corona, Queens, meeting Joseph Gordon's mother, Josephine. I had not lived here a year, but it was Sundays, almost always. Walking down the hallway, light stammering, her left Gilly's heel atop the toe of the right on her welcome mat, when I would drop by for rum cake. Knock, knock. Who's there? Memory. Memory who? After my first birthday in Corona, me on 104th in a 10-gallon hat, tombstone boots, toes turned up like a nose to a city sidewalk. 5-year-old Joe bullseying my sunken chest with a bow and arrow. When, like a bride-to-be, that memory walks down my mind's aisle, stops at the altar of my eyes. Does she see it? Should I speak it? As puffing a lucky strike, she invites me in. 2. Winter holidays, me at her apartment door, inching my index finger into the Christmas wreath, laurel, red bow, and berries, to ring the bell. Inside her cramped foyer, eyeing the salt and pepper meringue of her hot-combed coif, I give her a gift. Her seal-brown face searches mine. Getting is a denomination she's rarely belonged to. Knock, knock. Who's there? Memory. Memory who? Another bride walks down memory's aisle 1,000 miles and 15 years removed from when I was 5. Tuskegee's barracks, propeller pinned to my hat, senior cadets belting us newbies till we bled. All throbbing tonsils and teeth an inch from my potato nose, Joe was one of those upperclassmen. But on our own, far from the close-cropped obstacle course, Joe and I would chuckle about our old toy pistols and Corona wampum. We'd one-on-one, wondering how we'd only run into each other again under southern skies. Could she see this? Should I speak it? This memory at the altar of my eyes? Would this be the first time my newish neighbor would spot that friendship's wedding dress as Satin Nat's Christmas song inched from her True Tone radio? 3. One day to jiggle my kitchen pipe where cooked grease and coffee grinds had gathered, I'd come for pliers. Her coughing, then squinting through her Coke bottle glasses. Knock, knock. Who's there? Fact. Fact what? February of 44, Red-tailed Joe pierced the European sky. 6 months later, I'm still in Tuskegee, wrapped in August's itchy cloth, overwhelmed by advanced gunnery when bad news arrived. Operation Anvil, Tulun, strafing mission, flak burst, Joe downed. Without my own memory, that bride at the altar, how should I pronounce this? Man and life? For now, there's no worry did she see it in my bloodshot eyes as I handed her her pliers. This time, not merely a memory, but also a sad fact both of us held in our hands. That same day, the whole country heard another Joe, Kennedy. After serving as ambassador to Haiti and surviving one crash, lost Joe Jr. to a worse one. His bomber bloomed and instantly withered. Did that bring on her Caribbean Lord of mercy? Did she think that day about her pilot son, not imagining her doorbell would soon ring, her life unlock, because my childhood friend, her son, had also died that day? Now 12 years on, no pliers to borrow, no holidays to celebrate, I walked down Mrs. Gordon's hallway. Knock, knock on the door of this widow who lost her only child. My spiraling eyeballs, something she'll try to gaze into for a fitful glint of him. Bless you, Mr. Stewart. Excuse me. I don't do all this sobbing. So I'll try to do 2 more, possibly 3 if Lauren allows, and I'm timing myself. I try to be very respectful. Okay, so this is called Witch 2. I mentioned the 1712 revolt. So I was looking for agency of women outside of the home, outside of the domestic sphere. And as I mentioned, there was that revolt. And I did discover that there were 3 women who participated, but I didn't have names, so I was like, I don't know. And then literally the book was in production, moving along, and I came across this archival thing where it had at the bottom in even smaller print than the already small print, the names of 3 enslaved women who had participated in the 1712 revolt, Abigail, Sarah, and Lily. And either Abigail or Sarah was pregnant. Everyone was killed. They imprisoned her in the city hall dungeon because she was about 6 months pregnant, and they kept her alive till she gave birth and then hung her on the common. So the body of the enslaved is valuable even, in terms of, that's one of the timers I said, in terms of birthing. So, and she was shackled to a wall that had stones on it, and the Wall Street, I don't know if I said this, Wall Street was, it was, when they were developing the city, it was built because it was following a wall that had been there when the Dutch ran the city, and they had it built to keep the English and the Lenape, the native peoples, out of New Amsterdam. And they'll say the Dutch built the wall, but here again, tell the whole story. They didn't build it. 90% of the people who built it were enslaved Africans and then some poor whites. So she's shackled to some of the stones that they took down when they were, building Wall Street or laying it out. So the first half of the poem is a lot of diction about legal stuff, because where she was in prison, City Hall was above, so the governor lived there. There were legal cases and so forth and so on. Wainscot is the type of thing you can do to the lower part of your wall. We don't have to get into all the details. Then the second part of the poem is dealing with diction around birthing and contractions, because I'm imagining her giving birth, whether it's Sarah or Abigail, and this is lost to history. This is not me being lazy. It's called Witch 2, and 2, T-O-O. In a pinched and dank corner cell, at the corner of wall and broad, without interrogation or constitution, beneath rulings and arches, 4 dials on a clock, beneath arguments and archives, petite juries and Supreme Court, beneath criers and bailiffs, peals and flutters, beneath bells and constables and birds and cupolas, beneath perches and deputies, whipping posts and small talk, beneath windows and gilt, wainscot and lawyers, beneath deep thought and bench wigs, warrants and decorum, beneath 2 floors and black robes, conviction and hand-wringing, beneath plaintiffs and gavels, punishment and appeal, beneath charge and indictment, a hung head's arrest, beneath a trial and its rumors before acquittal and pardon, there's a case and its verdict before a judge and one's peers. Beneath sentences and pillory, evidence and stairwells, between wrongdoing and wrong done and who's right and what's wrong, the City Hall dungeon, where in darkness lies a woman with child. So no question of where labor, but when labor, what labor? Slave? Slave who labor even in labor. Sarah, Abigail, who is dying to lie on her left side, shackled to staples with staples affixed to history. Stone slaves once quarried to build a wall boiled down to a street. Which one's water break? Which one gush or trickle? Damp to the woolsey, sweet to the nose. How hard, when tender, abdomen, when hard, how tender, uterus, ache, how dull. Shackled to the staple to the bolted to the agony. Stone slaves once used to build. Pressure, pelvis, how long, when is during between? What is between enduring? The stench of a necessary tub? Contractions? Waves are water's pushy guest. 45 seconds or so. Which one's still talking? Maybe one. Shackled to the staple to the bolted to the memory. Stone slaves once used. Maybe 15 minutes later, or maybe one, maybe a minute or 2 later, or half a minute longer. Stretch marks, silence. Which one's stomach's a punch, clenched, a fist? Breathe into the lower back, into the ache, knowing you got not even a sip of say-so over your captor's shoe music composed on the floor above you. Shackled to the staple to the bolted to these echoes. Thank you. A necessary tub is a glorified name for a bucket that they put in the center of the room where she defecated, and as far as I understand, they did not take it out for the entire 3 months. And woolsey was a cheap wool that was given to the ancestors to make clothes come winter. So I'll say I'll close on this, and then we'll have questions, and I might do one other that has nothing to do with the book. This is called Mercy, and there was an enslaved individual who, during the 1712 revolt, was killed, and he likely did not participate in the revolt. His name was Klaus, and he was broken on the wheel, which means your limbs are tied to like a cart the wheel from a cart, and an executioner will hit your limbs until they snap and you die. A peck, it can be either a small or a large amount of something as a noun, and then I use peck as a verb. Kip is a street that was in Lower Manhattan that's no longer there. Trying to think of it. Oh, and then a penny knife is like the 18th century term for pocket knife. And we're in Virginia, so this is apropos. The epigraph is from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. A dude who definitely suffered from cognitive dissonance. He said we smelled and we were, subhuman, but he's having children with one of us and with someone who was underaged. So it's called Mercy, and I thank you for being here and listening. And I thank you, Lauren. I thank you, Dr. Gavin. I thank you, Furious Flower, and the African and African American Diasporic Conference, and Dr. Dolores. I didn't get your last name, but I never got it. I just got Dolores, or I would have said Dr. Phillips. Okay, Mercy. Along the city's jawline, by the wharf where a peck of slaves were auctioned, Klaus might have heard tell how Robin sunk a penny knife into the conch below his owner's shoulder. Now barefoot, he is stripped to the waist, bound to a wagon wheel, spokes versed in grass and its green obedience, mud scorched metamorphosis, the way snow delivers news piecemeal from the heavens. Limbs stretched, slowly rotated on that wheel, Klaus absorbs the dust, the turns, the deliveries, each journey's leg and arm. Executioners seldom traffic in compassion. This one punishes Klaus bottom up. First, a sledgehammer rains on his shins. Jesus, have mercy, he screams and rotates until they snap between gaps of the wheel. A wooden cudgel sings to his kneecaps. He howls and rotates till they shatter. Even the chalky, taunting throng winces. Then the thunder of an iron bar is administered to his forearms. He shrieks and rotates till they're smashed. The elbows, the chest, the endless bone cracking caught a quarter of a mile off, until, against God's own architecture, each limb dips like a fractured hammock. On the commons, between Broadway and Kip, the wheel is nailed high on a pole. Sparrowhawks peck at his broken body. For 4 days, for likely only having offered Robin a penny knife or shelter in the wee hours of an April morning, he is bloody, billowing laundry. Only death has the stomach to dry. Thank you. Okay, now I'll try to be quiet, and if there are any questions or comments, I welcome them. Let me just ask you one more question. Do you know what I'm referring to when I said the chalky, taunting throng winces? So I'm sure some of you know about lynching, and interestingly, the word actually comes from the state of Virginia. Does anyone know kind of the history of the word lynching? So there was a military guy from what is now Lynchburg, whose last name was Lynch, and he was a patriot, white gentleman, and and I think I said something about Tories in one of the poems. So the Tories were, people, whites living here who were faithful to the crown during the Revolutionary War, and so Lynch didn't like them, and here comes Jefferson again. He said, you have to deal with these people, and Lynch made his own form of justice, and actually the first lynchings were white men, but not hanging. It was whipping them. So that's where the term lynching comes from, that John Lynch whipped these white men who were sympathetic to the British. But I mentioned this, obviously it morphed into lynching African Americans, both male and female. And then also in the Southwest, they lynched Mexicans. Nowhere near to the extent of the 3,000 African Americans, but tell the whole story. And it's not a competition, right? So I'm saying that because the spectacle of lynching, I'm sure some of you have seen photos from the early 20th century where you see whites sitting and watching the lynching, and they were invited, they would have picnics and have fingers and what have you that they preserved. So this was also happening in the 18th century. It wasn't a lynching, he was being broken on the wheel, but they would be invited. And here they're being invited, but it's so horrific that they can't look. So that's what I meant by even the chalky taunting throng winces. And let me, again, tell the whole story. This level of spectacle, obviously it's overlaid. I don't use the term race, ethnicity, because it might be painful to some of you, but we're all descendants of the San Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert in southwest Namibia. All of us. All right? There are more differences genetically within what we might consider people of the same race than there are across. And this is a white guy, Spencer Wells, who has a whole thing. He's a geneticist and I think an anthropologist, Marissa, called The Journey of Man. So you can read it. And they gave it like 50 words in the New York Times because it was like too much to take. So this spectacle of watching was also something that happened, white people watching it in England primarily. So obviously it's overlaid with the ethnic difference, but it also has antecedents amongst whites watching whites, not lynchings, but hanging, which is not much different from lynching, but they were considered hanging. So okay, where that's from. So I'm all ears, or I'm open to any question or comment other than why were you crying? I don't know why, or maybe I do know why, but don't be scared. Go ahead.
My question is about research.
Uh-huh.
Because it's so obviously extensive. How do you call from all of that information to get to the poem? Because you have to leave so much out.
Yeah. So a lot of these poems, and I'm certainly not.
A question for the online people.
Can I? Oh, repeat. So the research, basically wanting to know like kind of how research gets to the distilling to the poem. And I like to say taking history and making it song, right? And I'm not as deft with the lyric as you are, and I know I write a lot of narrative poems, but some of these poems you're hearing were 2 to 3 times longer than what you heard. And yeah, that issue, because the thing about poetry, amongst other things, but one of the hallmarks is trying to deal with compression and sound. So it is that winnowing, and it could be overwhelming. I could read over 100 pages of information about one of these poems, one of them. And like, how do you kind of do that? I mean, the one, the Body is a Metropolis, there were more things I read, but there was a whole like 300-page book written by a fine scholar, Dr. Jill Lepore, who teaches at Harvard. And it was just about that event, 300 pages. And I'm trying to figure out, and literally one of the reasons I kind of said, okay, let me try to see if I can get to these fires through using body parts and sort of cataloging. Because how do I compress 300 pages into a poem that is still a very long poem, right? It's 3 pages, relatively speaking. I know they're epic poems, but you know what I'm saying. It's not a sonnet. It's not a blues of 4 stanzas. How do you do that? So, there wasn't always this science about it. It was just like, okay, there's just a lot of this here, and I'm just going to have to keep winnowing and winnowing and winnowing. And sometimes there were things I really wanted to keep. I mean, Frost, he had his bigotry issues. He said, I'm trying to remember how he phrased it. Sometimes the sign of the good poet is when you have to throw away good lines that are not in service of the poem. So it's not that it's a bad line, but it's not in service of that poem. So I hope that answered your question. You what? I didn't hear you, Lauren.
The silence.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I mean, you know, if there aren't questions, that's okay too. I mean, it could be a comment. It doesn't have to necessarily. Yes. Yes.
So being a poet seems to be a gift sometimes that doesn't come with a receipt.
Ah. Yes.
How do you manage the emotional burden that comes with it of telling these tragic stories?
So it's interesting, and people have sort of asked it in less of a poetic way than you asked. Oh, okay. It's like poetry is a gift that doesn't come with a receipt, and sort of how do you imagine, or how do you kind of manage, like the emotional weight of some of what you're dealing with, right? And I guess it's this topic because there can be poems that are light, right? And you know, they say you can't write about war in the midst of war kind of thing, and it isn't an exact analogy. But when I was actually researching and writing, I mean, there were things that like shocked me, but I was just like so kind of in it. It was just like, wow, you know, it's like, you know, there are nonfiction books, not a ton, but there was never a book of poems. And it's like, how is this possible, right? I grew up in New York City. I worked on Wall Street, which is just a few blocks from where this place is. I didn't know about this till I was in my early 40s. How is that possible? So I didn't really, there was shock, but it wasn't like, you know, kind of like you see me crying tonight. Like I didn't have that sort of feeling, but it was interesting. A poem I didn't read. I read that, you know, dialogue poem about the Columbia, but I have one that's a narrative poem called Assignment that's kind of literally about like these white kids taking the bodies and, you know, the free Negroes petitioning the Common Council. And like the first maybe 7 or 8 times I read that poem in public, the last line is, hell, you know, because it's medical school students, right? So the last line is, hell, at the end of the day, they were just homework, referring to the bodies. And every time I got to that, it was just like, I don't know that I can get through that. But so like in the researching, it wasn't really hitting me, but I mean, you're seeing me getting sobby here, but generally speaking, this doesn't happen since I started, you know, reading. But like the first 7 or 8 times with that particular poem, that last line, it was just either I would be pausing before for like 30 seconds or, you know, reading it and, you know, humbling and mumbling and blah, 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 you know, and blubbering. So it was more in that beginning of reading and didn't know I was going to have the reaction, you know, like I got up in front of some people and it was like, whoa, what's happening here? So I hope I answered the question. Maybe it was a not so, you know, not the answer you might have expected, right?
That was perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. Anyone else?
Sure, I'll say something. So for context, I lived in Connecticut and I'm 39 years old. I never knew anything that you talked about tonight. So thank you. I know it was very difficult for you at points to talk about it. So I want to say I appreciate you talking about it.
Thank you for saying that. And I'll share this. There was also slavery in Connecticut. And I have some poems about the first published, and Lauren and I were talking about it tangentially earlier, the first published Negro who was enslaved on Long Island. His name was Jupiter Hammond. And the first piece he published was a broadside, but he was taken by his enslaver during the Revolutionary War to Connecticut, to Hartford, and he wrote, he didn't have a book. The first book, and Dr. Gavin or Lauren might be able to confirm or not, because I'll read things that'll say, oh, she was the first Negro woman published, she was the first poet published, but as far as I know, she was the first Negro, period, in any genre, any gender, which is Phyllis Wheatley, to publish an entire book, right? It actually was published by a white English woman named Countess Huntington, Selina Huntington. She had to go to England to get her book published, but she, you know, had been abducted, likely from Senegal, brought here to Massachusetts, So Hammond didn't publish a book. He published like one-offs, but 3 of like the 5 poems that exist, he wrote when he was in Hartford. So just for your Connecticut thing, another little factoid you can hang on to. And then there was, prior to both Hammond and Wheatley, it got passed down, but there was an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman named Lucy Terry who had a poem, and like she didn't write it down or didn't get written down, but it was passed down orally, and it predates both Hammond's work and Wheatley's one poem. So,
Well, I appreciate doing that.
yeah, you're welcome, Corey. Thanks for the sound.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Or I would just like to ask about your process, because I've been reading a lot about poetic inquiry,
Uh-huh.
narrative poems and all this. So, I wonder, what is your process like? Do you let the poem just, after you read these books, this research book, do you let the poem just happen to you, or you be like intentional about, I need to get like one page out of this research to translate, immediately into a poem?
I mean, I think it's an organic. Sorry. Kind of, what's your process? And I think it's organic. It's different things. Like I said, there were lines that came to me in the dream state, and that wasn't like the whole book. And there are dialogue poems. There are kind of those longer narrative poems, which like coming out of like a 300-page book. Some of them were kind of inspired looking at archaeological, like photos of the bones. A number of the dialogue poems kind of come out of that. And I also work as an actor, so I think that's maybe why there are a lot of what we call in the dramatic mode, the persona, like the voice of Peggy in the house, the chimney sweep. Like I'm drawn to that. I've always been earlier on in my writing life, like writers like I and Patricia Smith, like just really, blew my mind the way they could go inside of people and bring this whole interior life. And then also the difficulty sometimes with that is if you're inside, how do you get at kind of the exterior and setting? Because it's almost can be contrived to have someone speaking and like describing the wall, right? Like people don't really talk like that if they're talking to you unless they're talking about interior design, right? So like they're also, or for me, one of the other things, and especially with Patricia Smith, that she seemingly does is she has this incredible sense of the viscera, the kind of psychological state of the speaker, but then she's also able to give you a sense of place a lot of times and it not feeling forced. So I'm kind of drawn to that also. And then sometimes things kind of come out of, almost like lightning, but I'll sit with it and like, I'll agonize over like one word. I'll kind of have the poem and like the music feels a little off. Even now, occasionally there's a word that I, throw in, turn from definite article to another because it feels like the music is off and it's like a 3-letter word. So it's kind of those things, but you're coming at it in different ways. The only thing I would say, I know writers and not just poets, but who seem to or they tell me like they write when they're inspired. And I think it was Joyce who said, you got to kind of think of it as like a job. You got to write like every day. And writing to me is also rewriting. So it isn't always writing something new, but like I get unmoored kind of psychologically if I'm not in some kind of relationship with the word at least half of the week and most of the time every day. So if on a more broader level in terms of process, like there's a feeling that I have to be in some relationship with the word regularly. And I will say this in terms of process, I always write a first draft, no matter how long it is, on paper. And initially, earlier on, I just considered it as kind of sacred thing. But then I was researching some stuff, and this guy said when you type on a computer, you only use 8 neural pathways from your brain. When you hand write, and this could be anyone writing for any reason, you use 80,000 neural pathways. So it's affecting memory, it's affecting cognition, it's also a mind-body thing that's going on. So that even affirmed further, write it on paper at least as the draft. I don't revise on paper because obviously having it on a computer can be really, helpful to be moving parts around, right? But that's definitely a part of my process. Whether that affects the effectiveness of the poem, I don't know. But always do that. I saw a hand. Yes. I think things choose you. Oh, I'm sorry. What about poetry, the written oral, how did you say, draws you in? Or, yeah. I think things choose you. You know, like I still have the first spiral notebook where it was a poem that wasn't like make a Mother's Day card in third grade or, you know, Valentine's. And it was actually riffing on Frost, stopping by woods on snowy evening, which, you know, miles to go before I sleep at the end. And I kind of was looking out my window. I grew up in the Northeast Bronx. And it was a very dark day, almost, you know, kind of the feeling like we're having here, and felt like apocalyptic. And so I started with that end line, but made it miles to go before I wake, and it just went into this crazy whatever. And I still have that. I was maybe 10 years old. But, you know, I played sports through college. Like, I was ashamed about my poetry. Like, wouldn't tell the guys on the baseball or football team that I wrote poetry. It was just like, I thought I was going to be an investment banker or a patent lawyer. Things choose you. Any other?
David, just a comment.
Yes.
I've had the privilege of knowing you for almost
17 years.
17 years. I said almost 20 years.
18 years, actually.
Yeah. And I remember your first presentation at JMU where you embodied the work of Langston Hughes. And your wonderful acting skills came out of that performance. And it's just so interesting to see the development of your style, the development of your craft. I mean, it is, I was sitting here and I turned to
It's like, who's this guy?
I know, I turned to Lauren and I said, this is a history lesson. I feel so privileged that I was here.
Well, I'm
Get
privileged
this
that you're here.
History lesson that you've given us, because this is information, as the gentleman said, that we don't know. We don't know. And we're in this period
Oh,
where
yeah.
people are trying to take
Shut
what
it
we
down.
know and erase that.
Shut it down.
But we have to do what you're doing. But I just want to tell you, it's been a privilege hearing the depth and the analysis and the critique of this world that you've now presented to us in terms of poetry in Manhattan.
Thank you.
Poetry that comes out of Manhattan. So kudos. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Lauren is one of the finest writers out of like our generation, and I don't say that lightly. If you get a chance, pick up Difficult Fruit, pick up Honeyfish. You will not be disappointed. And I know you want to finish up the last poem I was going to do one of your poems. No, I was going to do one of your poems.
Let's give this guy a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And speaking of book buying, David is signing and selling books over there, so please support your local poet, or at least your New York poet.
Well, I'm local tonight.
And also we have some, posters, if you want to get posters signed, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, online audience, for joining us.
Oh, yes.
Did you say you had one more poem?
I was going to do one of your poems.
No, we're going to stop you now. Okay. Thank you so much, David.
I have it memorized. And if you didn't feel comfortable asking a question from the audience and you want to ask, I won't try to hustle you for a book. You can talk to me, okay? Bless you for being here.
Awesome.
Bless you for being here. I have it memorized.
Which poem?
And I think it really would have been appropriate. I'm serious. That's part of when I was saying I needed to work. I was kind of confirming that I had it in my dome completely, you know, because with all